it, but there's no big crowd coming in, so here we go. I want to welcome you all to the last Westminster Residents Present of the spring. There'll be a hiatus until fall. I understand that we'll take up again in the fall. We're very happy to be in Harrisville Hall rather than on 1890, I think we need to say. Word of thanks is due to Lori Humphreys, although she's not here. I think she's already out of town. She was a spark plug and the major domo of this series, and it was away for part of the summer at least, but I think we owe her a big hand in absentia. So, as all of you probably know, Larry McMurtry recently died, and tonight Phyllis and Boyd and I will take a little time to remember McMurtry. He was born in 1936, after a good many people here, I think, including myself. He was a native Texan and finished where he started, back in Archer City, Texas, which most of us know only from seeing The Last Picture Show. It was also the site of many of his novels under the fictitious title Thalia. He wrote mostly of the American West, but not the romanticized version promulgated by the likes of Lewis, L'Amour, and Hollywood. In fact, he disapproved of that quite a bit. Phyllis will say more about that and about one of his early works. Phyllis?
There we go. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? All righty. When Boyd came up with this assignment, I realized that though I've lived in Texas 60 plus years and love it dearly, I'm no expert in Texana, so I needed to research. And I started that the same way that anyone in my generation would do it chronologically. I'd read the first 3 novels, the Thalia series. McMurtry was a young adult, just 24 to 25 years old, when he published Horsemen Pass By, using Archer City as his model for the town of Thalia. Fascinating is his ability to develop the rhythm and the dialect and the music of the language, but also the changes of that town through horsemen leaving Cheyenne and The Last Picture Show. In each novel, he gives us glimpses into the changes in the life and workings of ranchmen and cowboys, as well as glimpses into the societal problems and prejudices that live with us still. I thought that remarkable for a man so young and so essentially scholarly. For instance, black women. Helmia, Alma in the moving picture, HUD, and she's an Anglo there, is the black maid, although there were few blacks in West Texas in that post-World War II time. She pretty much runs the house and is a dear friend and confidant of Lonnie, our narrator. And she can make up her own mind. When she's treated badly by HUD, she decides to pack up and leave, and she does it. There's a tiny, tiny episode with a Native American woman on a neighboring ranch. She also is at the beck and call of the ranchers and the cowboys. And McMurtry uses stereotypical language to refer to the minorities, just as the ranchers and the cowboys would have done. Even better, he gives the language that slow, rhythmic, poetic quality that's the vernacular of small-town West Texas. You hear the music of this language in his books and his movies and his TV shows, and he had script writers that got it, especially Bill Whitliff, who did Lonesome Dove, our own Bill Whitliff, because that language was home for Bill. McMurtry refers to women a lot in the rural Texas area world. No professionals here, except for teaching literature. He makes it very clear that men don't teach literature and poetry because they wouldn't be real men. Women do that. But he writes about women with sympathy and understanding. He likes women. It's documented. One more thing that I found was fun was that he was indeed a bibliophile a scholar, a writer, and a reader with a couple of academic degrees, and he can't resist scattering literary and mythological references about. His academic colleagues will get them, even if we don't. Thalia, Greek goddess of comedy and one of the three graces. Horseman Passed By comes from a William Butler Yeats poem. So, with that, I'll read the prologue to Horseman. It's considered one of his great essays. This is Lonnie, narrator and half-brother of Hud, 17 years old, and possibly more than just a little bit Larry McMurtry here. He grew up in Archer City. I remember how green the early oat fields were that year, and how the plains looked in April after the mesquite leafed out. Spring had come dry for 7 straight years, and Granddad and the other cattlemen in Dry Bean County had to watch the bare spots widening in their pastures. But that year, the month of March was a long, slow drizzle, and when it ended, the bare spots shrunk again, and new grass carpeted the flats. When I rode out with him on Saturdays, Granddad would sometimes get down from his horse to show me how the grass was shooting its runners over the droughty ground. And he told me that nature would always work her own cures if people would be patient enough and give her time. After school on the weekdays, riding the long road home through the ranches and the old yellow school bus, I watched the range change. I watched the whole ranch country shake off its dust and come alive. At night, when the milking was done and the supper eaten, we sat on the east porch, the late spring dusk, resting and talking about the day. On the warmest nights, Grandma came out too and rocked for a while in the cord-bottom porch rocker, sometimes crocheting doilies to spread on the living room chairs. Even Hud might sit on the steps a few minutes, brushing his red suede boots before he left for town. But soon he would leave in his rag-topped Ford, and Grandma would get too cool and go back to her radio, and Granddad and I sat on the porch alone, though the best hour that lasted a while when he and I watched another day turn into night. Just before full dark, the bull bats came out from somewhere and swooped around the lilac bushes, and the horses clopped past the yard on their way to the dark grazing flats below the hill. A highway ran along the horse pasture, a mile to the east of our house, and from the porch we could watch the cars zoom across the plains, north to Amarillo or Raton, south to Dallas or Houston or Fort Worth. The big diesel trucks growled through the prairie dusk. The railroad was just the other side of the highway, and about sundown the Katy freight chugged by, pulling its string of oil and cattle cars. During the shipping season, the cars were full of calves, their bawling a lonesome sound at twilight. Sometimes the bawling stirred Granddad, reminded him of other times when he'd heard it, and of men he'd heard it with. Then he might tell me stories of his days on the big ranches, or of cowboys like his dead foreman Jericho Green. I sat below him, flipping my pocket knife into the soft dirt of Grandma's lilac beds, taking in every word he said. Granddad was an old man then, and he worked hard days. By 8 or 8:15, he was tired of sitting up, and around that time, the nightly zephyr flew by, blowing its loud whistle to warn the station men in Thalia. The noise cut across the dark prairie like the whistling train itself. I could see 100 lighted windows of passenger cars, and I wondered where in the world the people behind them were going night after night. To me, it was exciting to think about a train, but the zephyr blowing by seemed to make Granddad tireder. It seemed to make him sad. He told me one time that reminded him of nights on Roundup long years ago. On quiet nights, he and the other cowboys would sit around the fires, telling stories and drawing brands in the dirt. Some nights they would camp close to a railroad track, and a train would go by and blow its whistle at the fires. Sometimes it scared the cattle, and sometimes it didn't. But it always took the spirit out of the cowboys' talk, made them lonesomer than they could say. It made them think about womenfolk and fun and city lights till they could barely stand it. And long years after, when the train would go by, Granddad got restless. He'd stretch, push his old rope-bottomed chair up against the house. "Train's gone, son," he said to me, "bedtime." Then he took his coffee can spittoon over to the yard fence, stood there long enough to piss, and went in the house. With that, Granddad's day ended, and my night really began. I went to the windmill and let the faucet run till the coldest deep well water came gurgling up through the pipes. And after I drank, I sometimes went over and sat in the rope swing that hung from the biggest sycamore limb, to drag my feet in the sandy dirt and watch Granddad through his window as he got ready for bed. When he had his nightshirt on, he usually came to stand by the window screen, looking into the dark and scratching the scarred old leg that he'd almost torn off in a roping accident. Then he'd turn his back on the night and go to bed. When I knew Granddad was in bed, I went back to the windmill and stopped the blades so I could climb up and sit on the platform beneath the big fin. Around me, across the dark prairie, the lights were clear. The oil derricks were lit with strings of yellow bulbs like Christmas trees. The lights were still on in the kitchens of the pumpers' cabins, the little green top shacks scattered across the plain, each one propped up on stacks of bricks. 12 miles away to the north, the red and green and yellow lights of Thalia shimmered against the dark. I sat above it all, in the cool, breezy air that swept under the windmill blades, hearing one of the rig motors purr and heavy trucks growl up the hill. Above the chattering of the ignorant Rhode Island reds, I heard 2 whippoorwills, the ghostly birds I never saw, calling across the flats below the ridge. Sitting there with only the wind and the darkness around me, I thought of all the important things I had to think about: my honors, my worries, my ambitions. I thought of the wild nights ahead when I'd have my own car and could tear across the country to dances and rodeos. I picked the boys I'd run with and the girls we'd romp. I kept happy thinking of all the reckless things that could happen in the next few years. Some nights it stormed out on the range, and I watched the little snake tongues of lightning flicker against the clouds. When it was clear enough, I could see the airplane beacons flashing from the airport in Wichita Falls. Later, I climbed down, drank from the faucet before I went to bed. I tiptoed through the kitchen, across the patches of moonlight that sometimes lay on the cool linoleum, and climbed the stairs to my room under the roof. On nights when I was wide awake, I lay on top of the covers and read a paperback until I got drowsy, or until I heard HUD coming back from town. I was always ready to sleep by the time he came in. In the summers, I slept with my head toward the foot of the bed, so I could see the moon and the yard trees out the window. That way, I got what breeze there was. And that way, too, I only had to raise up on one elbow in the mornings to catch the lots and see Granddad and the cowboys catching their horses for the new day. I didn't always sleep the hours a growing boy was supposed to, but the nights that spring were a field that I left well sown.
How are you going to follow that? Phyllis, I think I'll let you read mine. We'll trade you for the stand. Or just trade blanks.
Use that one.
As long as the battery lasts. Whoops. Thank you, Phyllis. After Larry McMurtry graduated with a BA from North Texas, or what's now North Texas, in 1958, he went to Rice and completed a master's there 2 years later. He then went to Stanford for a Stegner Fellowship for a couple of years, and then spent a year as an instructor in composition at TCU. Said that he never really liked teaching, but he did one more stint going back to Rice then, from 1963. For 5 or 6 years, he was nominally a lecturer in English. I never heard him referred to that way when I was in Houston at the time. I just heard that he was a writer in residence, and I expect that really was more like his job. Several books came out of that time. 3 of them are called the Houston Trilogy. Although the best known, Terms of Endearment, was written later while he was in Europe. But of course it was set in Houston, as those who read it know, and probably even more who have seen the movie. During the time he was in Houston, probably 64, 65, he was a guest speaker at the Houston Psychiatric Society. It happened to coincide with the year I was president, so I got to meet him and talk for a little bit. He appeared wearing a t-shirt with emblazoned on the front in bold letters, "Minor Regional Author." He was, even by that time, not minor, but some reviewer had called him that, reviewing an early book. I don't know whether it was Horseman, probably. And he just delighted in it. And his wife had had a t-shirt, probably more than one, made for him, and here he wore it for his guest speaking engagement. And he, of course, told the story. He spoke off the cuff for about 5 minutes or so, and then he said he'd really rather talk about whatever we were interested in, and invited us to ask several questions. He didn't want a question-answer question. He said, give me several things you'd like to hear about. And with that, he went on for quite a while. The questions that mostly shaped the rest of his talk were about how he went about his writing. There was another question about what it was like to have his book made into a movie. That didn't take long. He said that Horseman Ride By was so far in the rearview mirror for him at the time they made the movie that he didn't remember it much and didn't much care what they did with it. He was hired for a consultant to be a consultant on the set. And he said he was generally pleased with how it turned out. He approved of HUD. He warmed up more to the questions about his writing, though. As to his work habits, which some were interested in, he, like probably many writers, set aside a certain time of day to write, and was very disciplined about that. He would sit at the desk for, it was either 3 or 4 hours, same hours. He might write 1 page, he said, he might write 20 pages, but he was sitting there just the same. And as I say, I think that's not unusual. As to, he warmed up even more though, talking about how he created his stories. First of all, he didn't start with any kind of outline, as some writers do, I think particularly mystery writers. He chose a place and a time and a set of characters and started writing. As he talked about his characters that evening, it was as if they were real people. He wondered what they would do next. He might have certain hopes for them which they didn't realize always. Some he was disappointed in or annoyed with or sad for. Some he admired a great deal. Characters he thought were minor might surprise him and become more important in the story. It was really striking to hear him talk about it as though this was a group of people he knew. I know all writers develop their characters, and character development is a big deal. And I'm sure every author's ideas about characters change as they get into writing the story, and probably develop and evolve during the writing of the story. And most stories concern the way events affect and change characters and the circumstances of the plot. But it was fascinating to hear the degree to which McMurtry seemed to work with a partly unconscious play of his characters. You can imagine a bunch of psychiatrists really ate that up. Even looking forward, said one of the joys of writing was getting to see what these people would do next. They were really a set of people for him. I suspect this facility of allowing his character to play in his unconscious was a part of his ability to draw characters in such a vivid way and for them to have such consistent, authentic, and varied voices. I was reminded of this aspect of his writing habits or method vividly, actually, when I read a new preface to Terms of Endearment. Terms was first published in 1975. This was a 1989 edition. It's the one on Kindle, actually. And he had written a new preface for it. And I'd like to read from that and then just a little bit from Terms. This is condensed, and I won't indicate all the ellipses. I suppose at the time I was hoping that Aurora, this was the woman in Terms who was played by Shirley MacLaine, thank you. I was hoping that Aurora, nothing if not impetuous, would plunge into a moral dilemma worthy of Anna Karenina or Dorothea Brooke. But no such dilemma arose. Aurora was, after all, operating in Houston, a town where anything goes. I tried to give her access to a New England conscience by having her born in New Haven, but no great moral crisis presented itself. A dilemma does turn up in the book, but it belongs to Emma, the plain, rather unprepossessing daughter, rather than to the vivid mother. And it is merely the common dilemma of a young woman who finds herself stuck with a boring, mainly inadequate husband, who's nonetheless a pretty good father to their children. Emma might, with luck, find a better husband than Flap, but can she realistically expect to find a better father? Mother and daughter make their choices. Aurora to take a cranky old general as lover in the movie An Astronaut. Emma to keep her family intact. I enjoyed the social comedy of Aurora and her suitors, and I fell in love myself with her wonderful maid, Rosie, who was barely an incidental character in the movie, by the way. Not merely because Rosie is an admirable human being, but because having her allowed me to set a few chapters in Houston's Fifth Ward. I also liked balancing the upstairs-downstairs aspect of it. And yet, as I inched through the story, I felt an impatience. I wanted to get Aurora's story behind me so I could conclude my decade-long involvement with Emma Horton. Although often praised for my insight into women, I'm still far from sure that I know what women are like. But if my hunches are anywhere near accurate, and if I'm not idealizing her too much, then Emma is what women are at their best. So, although the movie Terms of Endearment focuses more on Aurora, and by the way leaves Rosie as an incidental character, as I said, I'll read a bit from part 2 of the novel, which follows Emma after she and Thomas, Flap, leave Houston for Flap to pursue his career in academia, first in Des Moines, Iowa, and later in a smaller college town. But the marriage is slowly failing, and Emma is anguished about what this means for her sons. Starting on page 365. Fortunately for them all, she and Flap had made one another happy for 5 or 6 years when the boys were very young. They had that credit at least. For a time, their marriage had some energy, and it got them from Houston to Des Moines and 6 years into teaching. In the 6th year, Flap got tenure, even though he'd never quite finished his book on Shelley. They bought a house and had been living in it 2 years before Emma realized that she wanted to seduce Sam Burns, the banker who had gotten their mortgage for them. In the 2 years, something had slipped. Flap had quietly started to be a failure. He always expected to fail and slid into failure easily. In the context of academic life, it was as common and as comfortable as his pipe and slippers. But he hated Emma for letting it happen. It had been up to her to demand success of him. She was supposed to push, nag, bite if necessary. Instead, she left it to him, knowing he would rather sit and read, or drink coffee and talk literature, or, as it later developed, F students. Emma too knew that it was up to her. But the task of making Flap succeed was more than she could manage while raising two boys. It was a pity, but it was not her nature anyway. Flap had misread her to begin with. She too liked to sit and read. She also liked to sing songs with their boys and discuss life with them, to drink wine, eat chocolate, grow flowers, cook the 5 or 6 dishes she really knew how to cook, see movies, watch TV, and get laid now and then. All that in no particular order. Success demanded a particular order. Besides, she found successful academics universally obnoxious. Failed academics were at least sometimes a little sweet. She knew how obnoxious Flap would become if he succeeded. What she hoped for was a middle ground that would leave him friendly and relaxed and incline him to stay home a little, spend more time with the boys, and maybe even a little with her. The Shelley book would have been enough. One book would have done it. Yet he finished too long, kept reading, polished what he had written excessively, and never wrote the last 2 chapters. He published 3 articles, enough for his tenure, but that was that. And Boyd will now take us a little further.
Thank you. You hear me now? Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about Larry McMurtry's other side. His side as a book scout and a bookshelf owner. I'm basing my readings. I'm going to read some from Walter Benjamin at the Dairy Queen, which is a set of essays that he wrote back in the 1990s. And if you haven't read it, I certainly can recommend it to you because it deals with so many different aspects of his life that I found it really revealing and entertaining. And if Helen doesn't have it, I'm sure she will get it for you. As Phyllis said, Larry McMurtry was not above scattering literary allusions through his work. He was, after all, a literate and well-educated man, but and he didn't mind people knowing that. But he also had a self-deprecating sense of humor, and there are 2 stories in Walter Benjamin at the BQ that I will tell you. The first was at his father's funeral, and his uncle came up. One of his uncles came up to him at the funeral and told him, Larry, you need to find another line of work. He said, after your 2nd book, everything went downhill. The other story involves when he won the Pulitzer Prize for Lonesome Dove. He was in Uvalde, and he had been invited to come down and speak to students there about creative writing. And it was a small college, and he thought they deserved as much of his time as they could stand. So he gave them 8 hours of different kinds of meetings and classes, and spent 2 days in Uvalde. And when he got there and went to the motel, the marquee outside the motel had a sign up that said, "Welcome, Larry McMurtry, author of Terms of Endearment." And it pleased him so much because he had never seen that happen anywhere else, and he was very, very proud of it. And so he went through his day's lectures, and he got a phone call from his agent who told him that he had just won the Pulitzer Prize for Lonesome Dove. And that really made a real contribution to a perfect day. So he thought, well, he'd go back out and look at the marquee again and see what was up there. And he went outside, and the marquee said, "Fried catfish, $3.59. He said the citizens of Uvalde were streaming in and he joined them. I didn't know who Walter Benjamin was until I read this book, and really I didn't know much more about who he was when I finished the book, but I did go to Wikipedia and look him up, and he was a German-Jewish philosopher who died in 1940 in Spain, I believe, of a heroin-induced suicide. But he wrote a lot of essays and books, and he was particularly interested in the effect of technology on the culture. And the essay in Walter Benjamin at the Dairy Queen deals with an essay that Walter Benjamin wrote about the death of storytelling, and so Larry McMurtry spends quite a bit of time discussing that and concluding, I think, that it's not as bleak as Benjamin might have thought. And he tells the story of his grandchildren at a very early age able to grab the TV control and skip over or away from the commercials and then come back to hear the rest of the story. That there's an innate need and willing and desire among humans, very young ones, to hear the story and to hear the rest of the story. So he didn't think that storytelling was dead. This piece was written that I'm going to read from in the 1990s and bookstores were already failing, particularly the giant ones. And he laments that in this piece, where he discusses his career, which took fully as much time as his writing, as a book scout and a bookshop owner. But social media and e-commerce didn't necessarily kill off the bookshops. They were already wounded. At least the big ones were gone by the time he wrote in the 1990s. And e-commerce just finished them off, I think. He makes the point that bookstores will always be with us as long as the middle class are buying books. And unfortunately, I think the middle class is still buying books, but they're not buying them at bookstores. And so he was right about that. So I'm going to read this section about book scouting, which was new to me, and I think shed light on the other part of his life. I've always held off writing about book scouting and the world of antiquarian books, even though that activity and that world has absorbed me for more than 40 years. What has inhibited me is the knowledge of how difficult it is to communicate the fascination of this pursuit to those who don't share such fascination. To a book scout, the listing of great bookshops and booksellers is like a roll call of gods and demigods. But to the ordinary reader, the list will mean nothing. In the world of the book scout, reading is only one of the several stations of the cross. A book scout really doesn't need to read anything except title pages, bibliographies, and book catalogs. A more comprehensive knowledge would not be wasted, and some scouts possess it. But broad knowledge and deep scholarship are to the book scout not as important as a passion for the hunt and the energy to keep on hunting day and night, wherever in the world books may be, and they may be in a great many places indeed. I'm sure that I've had as much pleasure in the hundreds or maybe thousands of bookshops I've been in, going row by row and shelf by shelf, looking for a title or an edition that I've never seen, as my father did, culling and inspecting the many cattle herds he bought. For the process of selection, weighing the qualities of various animals in the mind, was a work that required judgment, sophistication, experience, and, if you will, taste. And that essentially is what I try to bring to the composition of my bookshops: taste, which, if applied persistently, will result in an interesting mixture of books, none of which is undesirable or unappealing. The iron rule in a bookshop is that good books don't pull bad books up. Bad books pull good books down. Even a few bad books can make a whole room full of good books look tatty. Composing a great or even a near great bookshop is as exacting a task as composing a novel. One has to be done word by word and sentence by sentence. The other, volume by volume and section by section. The travel books, the cookery, the jurisprudence, the angling books, all require close attention, for those are all categories in which dull and unappealing titles exist by the tens of thousands. Having a store full of what booksellers call interesting books, their highest accolade, is something every relatively ambitious bookseller strives for. Booksellers who manage year by year and decade by decade to keep their shelves filled with interesting books will rarely be the most successful financially. The world by and large is not content. The world by and large is well content to buy the conventional standards, the sort of books that make safe gifts to godchildren. But the booksellers who have interesting books will always have the respect of their fellow bookmen. Shops where there are interesting books are the shops where book scouts go to educate themselves. The big difference between book scouting and bookselling and the practice of fiction is that the former are progressive and the latter isn't. One just doesn't go on as a writer, getting better and better as long as one lives. The artistic endeavor required is too complex a balancing of abilities and energies for that to occur very often. But the trade in rare or antiquarian books depends on knowledge. The more one knows about books, the better books one is likely to handle. And there is no fixed point other than death at which one has to stop increasing this knowledge about books. This is one reason why the trade is so satisfying. If one has the will to learn and does keep learning, one will also likely handle better and better books. Many booksellers live to work to an advanced age, but the arc of a novelist's career is usually very much shorter, and their efforts bleakly unprogressive. If they keep writing fiction much past 60, they usually become their own recycling unit, reworking with less verb, veins already well explored. Self-repetition, if not self-parody, are the traps that await elderly novelists. Yet few novelists voluntarily flip the off switch, either because they can't afford to financially, or because they simply don't know what else to do with themselves. They grow old, they grow weak, they wear the bottoms of their trousers rolled, but they keep writing. In book scouting, though, every book read, seen, handled, looked up, studied, remembered is a grain to the silo of knowledge, which is the book scout's main resource. It never has to stop. The silo just keeps filling. It never bursts. From the time I first stepped into Barber's bookstore in Fort Worth in 1954 until only about 2 hours ago, I have been constantly in and out of bookshops. But nothing pales much quicker than a chronicle of books bought, bookshops visited, if the reader isn't also a book scout or a book dealer or a book collector. I went this far with such a chronicle mainly because I wanted to convey something of the excitement books generated in me then, but enough is enough. Who cares except myself and its shade that I didn't buy the signed Faulkner's Fable from Ted Brown in Houston in 1954, or that I bought my copy of Evergreen Review #2 at the Commerce Street newsstand in Dallas. The context of many of my book purchases mean a lot to me, but I doubt that I can expect them to mean much to my readers. This essay is partly about memory. Why does one remember one thing vividly and another thing vaguely, if at all? In the course of this piece, I've come to realize that the only things I remember, as well as I remember certain books found in certain bookshelves in such and such a condition, are women. About whom I mean to say little or nothing just about now.
Sophisticated sound.
Yes, just very briefly, I have a friend who, I sort of say was an antiquarian bookseller, but I'm not sure that ever changes, although she's retired and doesn't have a booth at the flea market anymore. But she was, this was a woman I knew briefly in high school and then later as the wife of a medical school classmate. Anyway, she knew McMurtry, bought and sold books with him over a number of years, and because her last husband was in Texas, would come to Texas most years, and she stopped by Archer City a time or so, and once said she found him in one of the bookstores, one of the houses where his books were, and he was sitting on the floor eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and reading a book. And they exchanged greetings, and she said, "Aren't you afraid you'll get the grape jam on the book?" He says, "Nah, it'll just make it look more authentic." That's a true to God story. And I believe Phyllis is going to do us the honor of reading his a little bit edited version of the obit from the Times.
Yes, and aren't we glad we have book people?
Yes.
Keep it going, yay. This is a bit, and some of it will be repetitive to what you have in your hands, from the New York Times obituary by Dwight Garner, March 26, 2021. Larry McMurtry, novelist of the American West, died at 84 in Archer City, Texas. He was married to Norma Faye Kesey, widow of writer and activist Ken Kesey, and lived with her and his friend and writing partner Diana Osana. Over more than 5 decades, McMurtry wrote more than 30 novels, many books of essays, memoir, and history, more than 30 screenplays, including the one for Brokeback Mountain, written with Miss Osana, based on a short story by Aunt Annie Proulx, for which he won an Academy Award in 2006. He accepted that Academy Award in a Texas tuxedo, blue jeans, cowboy boots, tuxedo jacket, shirt, and bow tie. But he found his greatest commercial and critical success with Lonesome Dove, a sweeping 843-page novel about 2 retired Texas Rangers who drive a herd of stolen cattle from the Rio Grande to Montana in the 1870s. The book won a Pulitzer Prize in 1986, was made into a popular television miniseries, as we all know. Mr. McMurtry wrote Lonesome Dove as an anti-Western, a rebuke to the romantic notions of a dime store novels and the exorcism of the false ghosts in the works of writers like Louis L'Amour. "I'm a critic of the myth of the cowboy," he said in 1988. "I don't feel that it's a myth that pertains, and since it's part of my heritage, I feel it's a legitimate task to criticize it." McMurtry relished his role as a literary outsider. He lived much of his life in his hometown, Archer City, Texas, 2 hours northwest of Dallas. He had the same postal box for 70 years. And for some 50 years, he was also a serious antiquarian bookseller. His bookstore once occupied 6 buildings and contained 400,000 volumes. Born in Wichita Falls, Texas on June 3rd, 1936, the family lived in what Mr. McMurtry called a bookless ranch house outside Archer City and later in the town itself. Archer City would become the model for Thalia, the town often appearing in his fiction. He graduated from North Texas State University in 1958 and married Jo Ballard Scott a year later. The couple had a son, James, now a well-regarded singer and songwriter, before divorcing, and McMurtry raised James. After receiving an MA in English from Rice in 1960, he went to Stanford and was Stegner Fellow as a Stegner Fellow in a class with Ken Kesey. That's why you find McMurtry in Casey's book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, and I will leave you to find those racy bits. In 1971, he opened his first book-up store, dealing in rare books. More bookstores ensued until he had his Archer City store. After completing terms of endearment, he entered, in his words, a literary gloom that lasted from 1975 until 1983, a period he did little more than lie on a couch for more than a year. That couch belonged to Miss Osana. They began living and writing together, he on a typewriter, she on the computer, editing and rearranging, and they were writing partners until his death. When I first met Larry, he was involved with about 5 or 6 women, she said. One day I said to him, "So all these women are your girlfriends?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, do they know about one another?" And he said, "No." Perhaps explaining his fascination with the country of his youth and the personalities that had already seen their heyday, he once said, "Because of when and where I grew up on the Great Plains, just as the herding tradition was beginning to lose its vitality, I have been interested all my life in vanishing breeds."
Well, we sped through that a little more quickly than expected. Any comments, questions, or reflections? Okay, for extra credit, without looking at the sheet in front of you, how many of you know Larry McMurtry's middle name? I didn't either. It's Jeff. Thank you all for being here. It was fun for us. Hope you enjoyed it too.